So the Northern Ireland Fishery Harbour Authority, we are an executive non-departmental public body. So we are a government body. And we were established nearly 50 years ago, but of course the harbours and the fishing community have been around for much longer than that, and there are records of Ardglass Harbour flourishing as early as the 1100s. We are the three main commercial fishing harbours in Northern Ireland. That's Portavogie, Ardglass and Kilkeel. We've got 2 to 3 main tasks. That's one, the long-term repair and renewal of the harbour infrastructure. Secondly is the day-to-day operations running the harbour. So that's run by our harbour masters at each of those 3 ports. And finally, we are expanding really into the third space, which is having a broader role in the community, recognizing that we're not just isolated isolated elements. We're actually part of a wider community of people and environment. Something that we are not the fisheries department, so we don't deal with quotas and sort of the fishery aspect. We are the harbours. And across those lovely 3 harbours, we have approximately 150 fishing vessels. And the fishing industry at large does employ at a scale of thousands of people, either directly through fishing or indirectly through processing and other related services. So yeah, the fishing industry is really central to a community across sort of County Down. So starting off, what is waste? Right, so waste it means any substance or object which the holder discards or intends or is required to discard. Okay, so apart from hazardous waste, which is the required to discard bit, waste is actually, I think quite interestingly, not defined by a certain set of features. It's actually really defined by how we view it or how we actually treat whatever it might be. And a little bit differently, but definitely related, is to waste, which I think fits in quite nicely. Use or expend carelessly, extravagantly, or to no purpose. So a lot of what we're actually talking about today is how humans, people, wastefully waste. So I think it's actually that extravagance bit and the part that we're doing, creating things for arguably very marginal purposes, that is really our biggest challenge with all of this. So one of our biggest problems is consuming stuff. Things that we only really see for a very brief moment in time in its much greater lifeline. So in some form, anything that we're using has had a long life before it gets to us and will have a very long life after us. So starting at the beginning, I think you really can't talk about waste until you start off talking about resources. So resources are building blocks of anything that we create. So yes, waste is a very important part of the picture, but it starts off as resources. So a little bit like these ants, they've got their dirt as their resource, and with that, they create something marvelous. So a little bit like people, and I'm going to use this example to show the first bit of our presentation, which is looking at sort of a linear economic model. Okay, so that's about producing, using, and then discarding, making waste. So as people, our step 1, this part about resources, we're looking at extraction. Right? So it starts off here. For one example, we are extracting resources, and of course, most of our resources are finite. And we use these amazing resources to make amazing things. So we go from extracting to creating. So we have, incredible impact on the world, but it is important to think that we are actually changing the face of the earth. We are using these resources. And then eventually, most things come to an end. Some things have much longer life cycles. Some things have very short life cycles. Cities usually longer, but they do come to an end. And when they do come to an end, a lot of those resources are recycled, but a lot of them are not. All of these processes take up a lot of energy. We have to remember that when we think of energy, we also think about carbon. So there's a lot of carbon emissions happening at every single one of these stages. According to Bill Gates in his new book, it is making things that is the #1 source of global carbon emissions. So the more we make, the more carbon we are also emitting. And we all know that we do not have an infinite quantity of carbon that we can emit. So next is another example, not quite construction, but this is about plastics. So plastics are almost entirely made from crude oil. It's fossil fuel again, so this is in two ways, both the production and its sort of material, responsible for a huge amount of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So you really cannot separate the making of plastic with fossil fuels and with carbon emissions. So we know that we are aiming to decarbonize and moving away from fossil fuels. So in some ways, there's a hope that that will reflect our plastic use in the future. However, we are still absolutely not there yet. And we're making small changes, even drilling for shale gas. You can still use that to make plastic. So at the moment, really, most of our plastic is made from crude oil. And that goes through the oils, back to our system, how our resources are going. Oil is our resource. It's going through a process, the refinery process, that breaks it down into its component parts, into naphtha, which is the material that is actually used to make, pull apart those hydrocarbons, put them back together into bigger links of hydrocarbons, which is called polymerization, which makes a sort of polyethylene pieces. Those are mixed up with usually some antioxidant stabilizers, different mix of things to make different types of plastics. And you end up with these things. Now, could someone tell me what those are? If you want to unmute yourself and shout it out.
Nurdles?
Yes, very good, Kathy. Those are nurdles. So we could have a whole nother conversation about nurdles, but those lovely nurdles are made to produce all sorts of different types of plastic. So those are things that we use and we see all the time. And eventually they end up as waste. And as they end up as waste, by the end of the week, you have more and more and more of them. Nonetheless, at the end of our lives, we have a huge amount. And a lot of that ends up in landfill or is incinerated. So increasingly, that's incinerated. We are reducing how much is going to landfill, but also incineration does also release a lot of carbon dioxide. So those resource journeys that we've just saw are examples of a linear economy, a linear economic model. So the idea of that is that these are a one-way street, okay? We're starting off with our resources, making whatever it is we're making, using what it is we're using, and then we're disposing of it, and it's ending up as waste, okay? So this one-way street is okay to begin with, maybe, but as time goes on, we're really offsetting the balance until eventually, we're essentially using things up, non-renewable resources. So that is what a linear economic model is like. So if you hear people talking about that, that is what that's about. And that is really what we are doing most of the time at the moment. Now, the alternative to a line is a circle. So this right here in its very basic form is a very, very, very important way that we need to start changing how we think, both for individuals, for policymakers, and for anybody who manufactures or produces anything. This idea of a circular economy. So this is the idea that we actually keep resources in use for as long as we possibly can. So we're actually trying to minimize waste and promote resource efficiency. So we've got resources coming in, it's made into something, it's used in something, maybe it's reused, maybe it's repurposed, maybe it's recycled, but the idea is that it keeps in this sort of economy. It doesn't actually leave. So we actually want to have as little waste as possible coming out of there. And this is something that, the UK government is very aware of. They actually brought in some waste regulation amendments called the Circular Economy Amendment last year. So this is happening and important that we are all in the picture for these changes. So why in particular is this important? Why are we talking about this? Why are we making amendments and adding policy around this sort of circular economy idea? And one of the major contributors to that is plastic. We are now living, and they say, in the plastic age, and that is because we produce an just unfathomable quantity of plastic. There's tons and tons of this in the world, so we cannot ignore that anymore. This graph shows us how much plastic has been produced every year. And remember that that plastic that's been produced is still in the world today. So if we look at that cumulatively, we're coming up to around 8 billion tons of plastic in the world that is currently in existence right now. Now that's quite conveniently very similar to the population, the global population. So if that's about a ton of plastic for every single person out there, and if you're not familiar with a ton, you can maybe picture a kilogram of anything, whatever, bag of sugar. That's 1,000 kilograms per person of plastic there is. So if you can picture that, that is a quite scary quantity. Okay, so plastic is not all bad. There's actually a few pros to plastic, which is why we have so much of it. It's cheap, it's durable, it's lightweight, and it's long lasting. For example, things like cars and airplanes, it's using plastic in producing these makes them much lighter weight, and yet they're still firm and tough enough to make sure that we're safe. And even being lightweight means that they use much less energy to use. We also use a lot of plastics in things like life-saving medical equipment. So there is space for plastic to be used in the world today. However, they are, I think, really predominantly pretty bad. As I mentioned before, they are extremely carbon intensive. To make, we said plastic is made out of crude oil. For one plastic bottle to be made, it takes approximately 1/4 of a liter, so about 1/4 of that bottle just to make that bottle. They can also be toxic, plastic, to plants and animals. And just like that pro of them being long-lasting, that is matched by the con of them being also long-lasting. This is a bottle that I pulled out of the riverbanks of the River Bann. I was out doing a sort of river clean, and it's clearly been there for a very long time, and it's still looking pretty sharp. So yes, so we've got these. Those are just a couple of the main cons. All those carbon emissions are really, for the most part, very much preventable. Now, in particular, one of the reasons plastics are so bad is the fact that so many of them are single use. We use them for minutes, 12 minutes for a plastic bag, and remember that long journey it's gone to get to the place where it's at. And then it's discarded, and we're left with it as waste, which is really what we're talking about today. So we really don't need most of the plastic that we're using. And in the UK, we are pretty bad. This is from 2018. Over here on the right-hand side, that column there is saying what rank we are in Europe for how much we are using of these various different single-use plastic items. Being in place 1 and 2 is not something that we should be proud of. So that is this represents a really big quantity of single-use plastics. Big doesn't sound like it cuts it, but yeah, so we are actually not doing very well here. A little bit of good news is that we are adopting some parts of EU's single-use plastics directive. In particular, we are adopting a bit that bans 10 main easily replaceable plastic items. So that includes a few items there on that list, and plus some more. So that's a step in the right direction. There are some good news stories too. However, we are still left with a major problem. These things, like we said, they're very easy to replace, but that's not necessarily most of the plastic. We still have a major issue with packaging. There's some things that are very dubious as to whether or not they are actually necessary. By the way, we are no longer shrink wrapping coconuts. It was Morrison's that got slammed fairly heavily for this, and they have since realized that it's not so much of a problem that both you can't put a sticker on it, and the other excuse was it might be a health hazard that some of the coconut husk, if you inhale that can be a problem. So, but it's still persistent. You might see those in the supermarket, and some of them we can say are definitely not needed, and some of them we actually feel like they are needed. And it's going to take a lot of innovation to change our habits, to actually remove these things from our lives. But there is something that we can do, and that is to apply the waste hierarchy. Again, could someone please unmute themselves and shout out to me, what is the waste hierarchy?
Is it like an upside down pyramid with
Yes.
refuse is at the top?
Yeah, keep going.
Oh no, I can't go past. Reduce, reuse, recycle somewhere.
Yes, that's it. Perfect. That's it. So we need to, this is one thing I'd like us all to take away, that this is a very simple key to how we can actually tackle this. So you're bang on, Connell, and you've skipped a slide for me, but you'll see in a second. Yes, reduce, reuse, recycle. I think we've heard that a lot, but I don't know if like internalizing how useful it is. I don't think we're necessarily there yet. So that's why we need to make sure we keep talking about this. So there is not a magic solution to all of this waste problem. However, if there was one tool that I think could really help us, this is it. It is the waste hierarchy. So if we do things, if we do these things, if we're reducing how much we use, which you're absolutely right, removing is the number one thing, but I like to keep it a little bit concise because we're all familiar with reduce, reuse, recycle. So there's more that could go into it. We'll keep it with that. If we do these things, we are actually participating. We are making a circular economy. Rather than a linear economy. This is moving away from just ending up with loads of waste at the end. So we need to apply this hierarchy, and absolutely you are right, it is a hierarchy. So at the top there, reduce or remove entirely is our number one aim. Then it's to reduce or repurpose, and finally recycle, which might come, we need to think about that a little bit, because we tend to think about recycling, which I think this slide is good. It's a bit of an optical illusion that the recycle looks the biggest, but they're actually all the same font size. And so that's I think a nice reflective optical illusion. Just to hit home hierarchy, what this is about. The food hierarchy, this is something that I remember learning. One of the first things I learned when you're at school is this idea that you are not meant to be eating sweets. You're meant to have one sweet for all the millions of apples you're meant to be having, okay? So it's super important that the big chunk is what we do the most of, and then sort of decreasingly down for the other aspects. So if you look at that again for our waste hierarchy, reduce is really what we need to move towards. We've been fixated with recycling for a long time, but actually reducing how much waste we're producing, reducing how many resources we're using is really the key to better practice. So really focusing on reduce and refusing, going zero waste if you can, but we don't have to all do that to get to where we need to go. We all need to be a little bit better. That's how we reduce our waste. So yes, this makes sure that our materials, our resources are not wasted. They're going back into our circular economy. Now, if we don't do any of these three things, which is what we're doing a lot of the time, the supposed, the next best thing is that we recover energy from waste. So that's controlled incineration, and we get energy from that. Quite a lot of carbon emissions involved there. So again, these are less bad, but still not the best options. And finally, we might send things to landfill, which, as you saw from those photos at the start, I think it is pretty clearly identifiable that is not a sustainable solution. So this is the DEFRA recommend for businesses and for people to use the waste hierarchy. This is a commonly understood thing. I think that, so this looks very like the one I just showed you, same aspects there. It's missing something that's very important. Again, does anyone want to shout out and tell me what they think that is?
Is it missing composting and anaerobic digestion for organic foods?
Yeah.
As part of the other
Yes and
recovery?
no. I think that that probably fits into the other recovery bit when you're actually getting something back from there. But yes, that could be in there. So the answer is yes to that. But I'm looking for something that's big and glaring that's really missing.
Is
Okay,
it
so
sustainable sourcing?
yes, so that feeds into how we can actually prevent and reuse and recycle better. So it's a little bit of a trick question because there's actually tons of things missing in there. But for me, I think the big thing that's missing from there is the absolute worst case scenario of what happens when we have waste. So if we aren't having it in the first place, if we're not reusing it, if we're not recycling, if we're not getting energy from it, if it's not going to a landfill where it's at least controlled, it's going to end up in our natural environment. And this is incineration, uncontrolled incineration, when you're burning it and all of the chemicals and carbon is going directly into the atmosphere. So really, this little litter section is what we're talking about today, and that is a very real option for what happens to our wasted resources. So to sum this up, what we need to be doing is we need to be moving anything up this hierarchy. So anything that we might have recycled, let's try and reuse it. And if we can't, ideally, we want to reuse it, reduce, remove, stop consuming things so much. But at least make sure there's less in the marine environment. So these things, not so good. And overall, we've got a big picture of what actually goes on in our waste. So everything we're doing currently fits in here. It's just a matter of becoming aware of it. So in Northern Ireland, we produced in 1 year almost 1 million tons of waste that was collected by the councils. And unfortunately, I know we're aiming for reducing. Unfortunately, this went up by 1% from the previous year. Most of that is household waste. The remainder of that would be sort of industrial waste. And some actually quite good news is our rate of sending things to landfill, again, quite low on the hierarchy, is reducing. It's now at about a quarter. And that's, for some perspective, in 2007, it was 3/4 of how much we were producing that was actually going to landfill. So our recycling rate is actually about 50%. And what that means, if we combine this total number of tons with how much percent of that is household waste, divided by how many people we have in Northern Ireland, we have each of us producing almost 1/2 ton of household waste every single year in Northern Ireland. So, sorry, I feel like I'm a real bearer of bad news, but it's just a little bit of the truth. How does that look like compared to our immediate neighbours? So Wales are leading the chart. Wales have got 54% recycling waste. Northern Ireland is at 47%. England 44.7, and Scotland is 42.8. So we're in second place. I think that we should at least be aiming to beat Wales sometime soon. So globally, this is actually pretty good compared to a lot of countries. And unfortunately, that is pretty bad news for the world at large and our plastic problem. But that also means, 50% means we've still got a lot of room for improvement. So we have to remember that this is what's recycled and been put into landfill, and we still have this problem with our worst case scenario, which is what we're going to talk about next, about actual litter. So in Northern Ireland, again, our marine litter sort of sphere. This is research conducted annually by Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful. They recorded over 22,000 pieces of litter across 11 beaches. That is 500 pieces per 100 meters of beach. So it's, I know you've all been on beaches and you've seen it. That's what it looks like. This is a beach up somewhere in the north coast. And the vast majority of that litter was plastic, which again means it's not going away anytime soon. And the vast majority of that plastic was single-use plastic. That's all the dark purple bits in this slide. There is also a considerable amount of fishing gear, which at the Harbour Authority I am very aware of, and I've big ambitions to change that. It's not going to change overnight, but that's partially why I'm here. But seeing all of that plastic is worrying, but it's good to know. So that leads us on nicely to the marine plastic problem. And I'm going to hand over to Gala to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks very much, Jenny, for that very visual presentation of the problem. So I'm going to talk a bit about marine plastics and share my screen. I will be the bearer of some more bad news, but also what you can do in the end. So just a second to set myself up here. Can everybody see the presentation full screen? Somebody can put thumbs up. Yeah?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to talk briefly about marine litter in general, and then focus on plastics for reasons that Jenny already explained really well, because it is over 78% of any kind of litter and marine litter is really plastics. Then I'm going to talk about call to action, and then we can have a question session where you can either unmute yourselves at the end and ask us whatever you would like to, or if you're not comfortable with that, feel free to pop it in the chat, and then Alicia will read the questions at the end. So I want to talk about today about how plastic gets into the sea and how it affects wildlife. So before I even start talking about marine litter, I used this slide last week, so you might have seen it if you were here. If not, I just wanted to say, to put a bit of a reminder of what the oceans provide for us. So what does a healthy sea actually provide for us, other than, fish and shellfish? So actually it does quite a lot. One of the main things why our oceans are so important and why we want them healthy is not to keep the wildlife that lives in them healthy, but because they produce over 50% of oxygen that we breathe. So we always think about the Amazon forest and lots of forests producing, and trees in general producing oxygen, but little tiny seaweeds called phytoplankton or phytoplankton, depending where you're from and how you want to pronounce it, they're actually producing most of the oxygen. So the ocean, covering 70% of the earth, also regulates climate and the water cycle, nutrient cycles, all kinds of things. It's also a great resource for things, resources for medicine, even cosmetics. It provides lots of kinds of jobs. And since we're an island, it's obviously very important for transportation. So 95% of all our imports and exports in the UK come through cargo ships and through the sea. So in order for the ocean to provide all these goods for us, for people, it needs to be safeguarded from pollution, from litter, from exploitation over sustainable limits, and from global warming and the effects of climate change. So the biggest issue really with the ocean is the fact that a lot of those things we can't see. And I hope that through the next few slides, you will see that what we see on our shores is a very small fraction of the actual problem. So marine litter is an easy problem to talk about because it's visible, but our oceans are actually also threatened by global warming, which not only changes the temperature of the sea, but also the chemical characteristics of the sea. So it might become more acidic. It also changes the levels of oxygen in our seas. So think about what small changes could happen in the air we breathe and how significantly this would affect us. So all creatures in the ocean are actually suffering from the effects of climate change. There's also habitat loss for different reasons. So loss of homes of animals, equivalent to loss of forests. There's also pollution, marine litter, obviously, and then our seas are really busy. So you can have disturbance just by the noise of the vessels they can annoy cetaceans or other animals. So cetaceans are whales and dolphins, or there can even be accidents given the fact that there's so many vessels around our seas. Okay, so marine litter. So marine litter is any human-created waste that has been discharged to the coastal or marine environment. So just a little tiny kind of poll. How long do you think a polystyrene or styrofoam cup takes to degrade in the seawater? If anybody wants to give us a number, unmuting themselves.
400 years.
Well, that one of, yeah, so a lot of plastic in general, yes, but this one, luckily, because it floats in the sea, it ends also having sunlight to help it degrade. So it's one of the good case scenarios, but by no means am I advising you to use more of them. It actually has a shorter lifespan than previously thought, so 50 years. Let's look at these guys. What do you think about metal? How many years? Any takers?
40?
100?
Close, 200 years. Progressing on to the typical water bottle that we all use. So somebody had said 450 years, and yes, that's true for this one. And then elements of fishing gear in terms, not the metal bits, but actually the plastic threads that hold things together, they can take over 600 years to degrade. And while they're not degrading, they're still fishing. So if you have parts of expensive fish nets taken out by a storm, or end up in the sea bottom, they actually still fish for things even though we don't see it. So this is called ghost fishing, and it's a huge issue. It's you know, you can't help it, storms are storms, but just to give you an idea of what else is in the sea. So mainly everything derives from single-use plastics. Really, the majority of the waste of the plastics in our seas is single-use plastics. So let's talk about that now. Plastic in the sea. So plastic was actually invented in 1907 by a Belgian-American chemist called Leo Baekeland, and he created Bakelite. So that was the first real synthetic mass-produced plastic. And every single piece of plastic, apart from maybe some styrofoam under the right conditions in the sea and under sunlight, still exists. So that graph that Jenny showed, we're creating more and more plastic, but all the plastic that we've created is still here. So in terms of our seas, 8 million tons of plastic enters our seas every year. To put it in a different perspective, that's about 1 truckload of plastic per minute that ends up in our oceans. So just before I go further, Alicia, could you kindly launch the poll of what is the #1 plastic that we find on our shores? And also, I won't be able to see the results as a co-host, so if you want to read it out loud, that would be great.
Yeah, okay.
Have we got lots of people voting there?
Yeah, we're nearly everyone has, so.
Perfect. So what does everybody think? What's the most common thing found in our, well, not only on our shores, actually globally?
Cigarette butt.
Yep. You said it before the launch of the poll. What other, what did other people think? What's the most common thing?
The most common thing was plastic bottles.
Okay, yeah, it's actually cigarette butts. So cigarette butts are made of plastic. They don't degrade. So we kind of tend to think of the cigarette as something that we consume, and then because it burns, it kind of just will biodegrade, but it doesn't. And birds will eat it, animals will pick it up. It's a huge issue. Okay, and then just to put things into perspective, so the 8 million tons of plastic that enters our sea every year will, going the wrong way, will double by 2027. By 2050, there will be more plastic in the sea than fish. So it's shocking if you think about it in terms of our children. So that's in 29 years when our children born this year or last year will be in their 30s. So I'm now in my 30s, and I've got hopefully a long way to go. So having this issue of lack of food and more litter in our seas, it's a huge problem. So it's not that far away. So let's start listening to these statistics and not thinking of them as far, far away ahead, because they're not. They're right here and affecting our children and the next generations. Okay, so how does this plastic end up in the sea? Well, there's different ways. 80% actually comes from land, which I suppose makes sense. And almost 50% of world populations live somewhere close by the sea. So through rivers and everything, plastic will end up in the seas. So the 6 degrees of separation is really an example to show you how this works. So firstly, you have a plastic bag from a store in the city. You might add it in a trash can, which if it's overflowing or it's overfilled or it's windy up, it just ends up in a storm drain. Or I live in Belfast, so a lot of things end up in the Lagan. And then of course, where do things that fall in the Lagan end up? Into the sea. So it starts affecting marine life where it can cause huge problems that I'm going to talk about in a second. So I'll also talk about washing our clothes. So things don't only enter by accident. So even when you're doing a good thing, putting it in, recycling it or adding it in a bin, it can still end up in the ocean. Another major reason how things from households end up in the ocean is because people tend to flush all kinds of things down the toilets, which is why Northern Ireland Water has actually really campaigned for people to remember that only the 3 Ps, so pee, poo, and paper, are the only things that can go down the toilet. Everything else can block the pipes or end up in the environment. So no matter what it says on the particularly plastic wipes, which are 93% of the issue that blocks pipes, they might say biodegradable, but then if you turn the package around and look at the tiny little letters, it says harmful to aquatic life. Well, that's because they're lying, because they will not degrade. They're plastic. So please do not flush anything else, not cotton buds, nothing else other than the 3 Ps down the toilet. And I know this is a yucky thing to be talking about, but it is a major issue. And when doing a beach clean, a lot of the stuff that we find is actually things that has ended up there through the toilet. Another thing is also washing our clothes, which I'll talk about in a bit. But the problem again with marine plastic ending up into, plastic ending up into the sea is that we recycle a lot of things, and we're proud that we recycle in the UK quite a lot, as Jenny showed. But the issue is that we export our recycled plastic, and we're exported a lot of it, like over 80% goes to Malaysia, for example, then Turkey, Indonesia. And not all of the areas where they end up, the people there don't have the capacity to deal with so much of our waste. So it ends up, we recycle it, hoping for the best, but then it ends up seeping into the ocean and affecting those people's lives. So we're in Malaysia. So again, the issue is that we cannot see it, but the problem is still there. Okay, and the 20% or approximately comes from ships and boats at sea. So there's a lot of vessels in our seas, cruise ships, fishing ships, all kinds, research vessels, all kinds. So then they also end up either by mistake or recklessly throwing things into the sea, mostly cruise ships. Okay, and then just before I explain what happens to the plastic, let's have another quick poll. How much marine litter do you think actually washes ashore? Alicia, if you can launch that poll, please. So this is the portion that we end up seeing and we worry about and we do all our beach cleans. How does it look like, Alicia?
Yeah, just going to end it now. So most people say between 5 and 10%.
Perfect. So yes, that's actually true. So the majority of plastic that ends up in the sea sinks. And this is why I keep using this picture, because it shows it really well. We focus on what we can see, but the majority is still there. It sinks. And then 5 to 10% washes ashore and creates this horrible images on beaches and shores that we see. The rest of the percentages actually end up forming like a plastic soup in our oceans, so they float about. And that is an issue because plastic slowly breaks down into microplastic. And microplastic is just smaller bits of plastic, so it hasn't degraded yet. It's still there. It's just broken down in smaller pieces. So microplastics actually bind or contain toxins, and then they are carried out into our food chain. So the issue there is, if you think about a simple version of the food chain, to simplify it even more, smaller animals get eaten by larger animals get eaten by even larger animals, top predators, and then humans mostly like to eat the biggest animals. So not shark in case of this picture necessarily, but bluefin tuna or cod or other species that are actually quite high in the food chain. So microplastics and the toxins that we talked about can actually stay in tissues of all these animals. So because they're not expelled into the environment, we end up with a lot of it up the food chain, and they come in our bodies, and they have actually been found in human bodies and excreted recently. So it's not something that can hypothetically happen. It's something that's already happening. So another way I mentioned, apart from toilets and accidental or reckless throwing of plastic into the sea, is actually by washing synthetic clothes. So synthetic clothes are actually all made out of plastic. So if it doesn't say cotton or some form of cotton, it is synthetic. And you can find a lot of websites on how to recognize this, but generally, if it's not 100% cotton, there is synthetic in there. So every time you wash this, thousands of microfibers end up into the sea. So there are things that you can do this, and we will send an email around next week with links of what you can do to help reduce this problem. But you can buy like a filter called Guppy Friend bag where you add your clothes in there and then it doesn't let all the synthetic things go out. You can wash your clothes on lower temperatures or less frequently. So we have this culture in the Western world of walking with pristinely clean, lovely smelling clothes, but we're not surgeons, not all of us. Like, we don't need to be sterile every day. I mean, I'm not saying you walk around with stains, but you know, if there's a stain, you can wash the stain. You don't need to wash the whole of the clothing in the washing machine. Another thing you could do, which is more expensive, is add filters to your washing machines. So Germany has actually started doing that and making it as part of an obligatory move for washing machine producers to add these filters into their systems. There's petitions going around asking for just that to be done in the UK as well. Okay, so how does it affect wildlife? I'm sure this is stuff that you've heard before in regards to wildlife, but I'll just go through them quickly. So there's three ways really. One is plastic ingestion, so they eat it, and then it can directly obstruct their colon, so their gut, or it can actually stop them from getting nutrients from the rest of the food that they eat. They can also get entangled, so suffocate that way, or suffer injuries that will lead to an infection that will later on become fatal. Or they can be toxic, those microplastics, by accumulating in their tissues. Eventually they will start having an effect on their reproductive system or their nervous system. So every year, 1 million seabirds die from eating or becoming caught in marine plastic. So seabirds are, I'm starting with seabirds because they're crucial here. So we've seen things getting entangled and stuck, but that's not the only reason. They also, like gannets in this picture, tend to use all kinds of plastic to build their nests. And then the adults and the chicks can get entangled or ingest them and eventually die from an infection. So this is the way we see jellyfish, which is what a lot of marine mammals and seabirds would eat. But while they're staying in the sea for a lot of time, this is what they look like to animals, to marine turtles, for example. So we might see the difference between this and this, but animals don't. And it's because a lot of them don't really rely majorly on their vision underwater. They rely on the smell. And while they're floating about in the sea, plastics actually start smelling and have a lot of marine bacteria and different things that make them smell pretty much like any other item that they would potentially eat. So this is kind of where it gets confusing for the animals. So it's not a lack of IQ, it's just a lack of relying on the vision. So this is what ends up, this gruesome picture here. So this is an albatross. It's not a species that comes around our waters, but the same happens to our fulmars, which we do have around our coasts. So they end up feeding their little chicks all kinds of things. And I mean, they go through really rough conditions. So one parent stays with the chick and the other one flies and gets food. So they get their mouthful with whatever food they can find and bring it back to the chick. A lot of it ends up being plastic, which obviously you cannot survive this amount of plastic. Another unfortunately gruesome picture, and it not only affects smaller animals, but also marine mammals, turtles and sharks are killed by marine plastic. So over 100,000 of them every year. So this is an example of a whale, a sperm whale in this case, from 2018 that was found in Spain. And its body contained over 29 kilograms of all kinds of waste, mostly plastic again. And then of course we have the side effect of COVID. So COVID, we were doing pretty well after Blue Planet was launched, and people were talking about reducing single-use plastics, but then because of the pandemic and the risk of infection, we were going back to using single-use plastics. And this is a picture of one of our volunteers, the North Coast. This is just a sample of what they found in about 10 minutes. So it's all masks, which is also, again, made from plastic. They're not made from cotton or anything. So we will follow up an email with what exactly you can do with each of these actions, but just to go through them quickly for some positive news after all this doom and gloom. So 1, refuse to buy plastic whenever you can. This becomes easier with cosmetics and maybe things like cleaning liquids or powder, but it becomes quite tricky with food. So you might end up having to go to a few different stores if you want to reduce your plastic rather than just going to one store and getting it all there. Which is hard to do when you have little time, but even if you just start thinking about it and avoided it where you can, it's already a huge move forward. Only flush those 3 P's down the toilet. Use filters in your washing machine. So if you don't want to buy the filters that cost about 150 and install them, you can buy the Guppy Friend bag, which has been produced in Germany, and it's really effective. It stops about 87% of the microfibers getting into the sea. You can also write to your MP to ask for change. So this is something you can do for any problem that you're worried about. So you have the power to voice your concerns for anything with your local MPs or MLAs, or even go further towards the parliament. You can sign petitions, and you can, but the most effective way, even more effective than petitions, is actually writing an email. And you can just keep sending and sending that email until you get an answer. So the more of us that do this, the more we will encourage change. And lastly, you can join joint beach cleans between me and Jenny, or adopt your spot with Keep Northern Ireland Beautiful. So I'll send all these links next week. And we're waiting to see what the restrictions are before we have finite dates for beach cleans, but that's also one of the things you can do. And then lastly, a reminder, in 2 weeks, on the 10th of April, we have a session called Be Inspired and Get Involved. And 2 of the guest speakers are going to focus on marine litter and what you can do about it. And the other 2 are going to focus on how you can get to know your marine environment a bit more and become a marine recorder. So just before we go to questions, we have one final poll for you guys, which is just a feedback, which helps us figure out how we did and what you would like to see further. So Alicia, if we can launch that poll, please.
I would like to apologize for the late running of this because my presentation took longer than I had anticipated. So I apologize. And if you guys are happy to stick around for a little bit, we are going to still take questions and answers, but apologies, it's a little bit later. That was a fantastic presentation, by the way, Gala. So it's great. It was learn a lot in this like little short space of time. It's like, it's almost a little bit difficult, I think, for both of us trying to make these presentations when there's such a huge amount of data and information and ideas and problems and solutions to try and pull it all together.
In 1 hour, it's not easy.
Right.
So is the poll done, Alicia? Can we launch it?
Yep.
Sorry, launch the results.
Yeah. So more than half said that they did learn something new today, so that's good to hear. 97% said that the session inspired them to change something in their everyday life.
Wow. Amazing. That's really good.
Yeah, and 94% said they enjoyed today's session a lot. So
It's fantastic.
That's really good. Thank you, everybody. So shall we go through the questions now? You can ask, there's a lot of questions or comments in the section in the chat if you want to read them, and then Jenny or I can answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to make one just brief comment on your one aspect of your presentation, Gala, and that is that the seafood that we do bring in Northern Ireland and across the UK and across Europe has to meet extremely stringent health and safety and quality regulations, and is absolutely deemed very safe and well for human consumption. And I think that it's part of a growing and wider conversation about what we're eating and what sort of micro chemicals are in there. And I think that when I think about these things, it's in a world of agriculture where we use a lot of pesticides and very known, very damaging chemicals in lots of food substances. So it's an important part of the conversation, but just I think that's an important bit of context in that wider picture.
Yeah. No, I should have mentioned that the food is still safe to eat, and I'm not referring to Northern Ireland's fish in general. I'm just talking about a global problem. But yeah, you're not really safe from chemicals anywhere these days, and it's hard to know what you're eating.